Good morning, St. Mark's, in-the-Bowery. It's really an honor to be here with you today. I thought it made a lot of sense to talk about our gospel. So yeah, he said. So the gospel today puts Jesus back on top of a mountain, but this time it's the Mount of Olives. And he's looking out at Jerusalem. The Jerusalem temple, this is just days, years, and months before it's going to be destroyed in the Jewish-Roman War. And he's dropping truth. He's telling these 4 disciples some truth. And just to sort of be able to picture it, these are people who have traveled with him for a really long time, who have been the victims of injustices and suffering, who've seen him stand up to and circumvent the Roman Empire. And now they're sitting here in the shadow of this massive temple that, while representing inequity, still represents greatness and so much potential. And so they stop and they say, "Look, teacher, look, rabbi, look what large stones and what large buildings. Look," we've said to one another, "look at how cool this new iPhone is. How about this electric bike, this new gadget, this amazing technology, this AI, this ChatGPT, look what it can do." No matter who mined the components that were necessary to bring it to us, no matter who does not have enough money to enjoy it, look how amazing. But then Jesus kind of stops their admiration, right? It's a little devastating. He stops their fawning over buildings and material things, and he tells them that the life that they knew is about to change. He could have been any one of us watching the elections. He could have been any one of us watching appointments for the future president coming in. Life is about to change. And so we picture Jesus, cross-legged, teaching position, on this mountain with this great temple behind him as he begins to speak. And so I'm a seminary student, and my New Testament professor tells me that this is no normal speech. And so, since I'm a good seminarian, I've learned that he is speaking in the voice of prophets, and that this speech is his last speech before he's being put to death. It's the first part of the longest sermon that he will give in the Gospel of Mark. He has a lot of lessons to teach people. He begins to prophesize. He says, nation will rise against nation, kingdom against kingdom. And so what? We in 2024 can imagine what that would feel like. Even if we're not fully clear on the statistics, we're not shocked to learn that in the past 3 years, there have been more violent state-based conflicts since World War II. We know as we watch the escalating violence at Ukraine's border, as we watch the escalating violence in the Middle East that evolved from Gaza, as we watch what's happening in Sudan and the Democratic Republic of Congo, and so many other places, that what we are witnessing is an unimaginable escalation in the potential for violence in our time. And Jesus, from on top of the Mount of Olives, from on top of this mountain, is warning his disciples of earthquakes, of famines. And we know this prediction as well, because when we really sit down to understand the potential devastation of the climate crisis that's already underway, the crisis that Hurricane Helene has already caused, more devastation than Katrina, the forgotten wildfires in Wyoming, the 80-degree days in November, he could well have been talking about the numbers of people when he talks of famine that are facing catastrophic levels of hunger around the world, the numbers that have doubled since 2022, to the highest levels in a decade. He could have been talking about the additional 3 million people in the United States that have been thrown into food insecurity in the past year, with inflation threatening even more. But then Jesus isn't even finished, right? He's just getting started. After all of these warnings, he then has the audacity to tell his disciples that when they hear of these things, or the rumors of these things, and he has to tell them the rumors of these things because his disciples, like us, they're doom scrolling, right? They're like looking over their iPhones, they're watching cable news, they're looking at TikTok and Facebook and spending hours in front of news commentaries that really can no longer be really called news anymore. They're waiting and looking for facts and information for things, for explanations for things that have no explanation. Jesus has the audacity to tell his disciples that when they hear about these catastrophes, or rumors of these catastrophes, that they should not be alarmed, because all of this stuff will just happen. So what are we as Christians to make of today's gospel? What were Jesus' disciples to make of when they're facing the destruction of their own towns and villages after a generation of oppression and taxation and food deprivation? Where is the justice in that? What are we, in the midst of devastation after devastation, trying to recover from a divisive election, trying to rebuild our communities? What are we all to do with this message that tells us in the face of chaos that we should not be alarmed? This passage was predicting the destruction of the Second Temple in Jerusalem, and it's often used nowadays as a kind of end of times writing, something that tells us that we should just be resigned because climate change is going to destroy everything, these wars will just continue, and there's nothing anybody can do about it. And while that is how sometimes this passage is wielded, the takeaways for what Jesus' words are very different. Because if we look closely at the gospel passage, Jesus also says to us, the end is not yet. Do not be alarmed, he says, meaning don't be afraid. The end is not yet, he says, meaning we are not to give up. That while trauma is going on, we are to maintain a posture of witness. While there are horrors yet to come, this is not the time for the nihilism of apathy. This is not the time to hide our heads in the sand. And so we are not to be alarmed, and we are not to resign ourselves to the horrors, because the end is not yet. And then, just in case his disciples didn't understand him, just in case we still don't get it, then Jesus said, very, very clearly, this is but the beginning of the birth pains. Birthing pangs. Jesus tells us his disciples that these are birthing pains, bringing to mind one of the most universal and visceral and most understood of all human experiences. Birthing pains that imply universal as well as individual, because there's not a human alive that wasn't born. And yet the contractions that pushed all of us into this world are at once part of our collective story, but they're also the individual and distinct province of the women and femmes who bore the pain. They're also the distinct province of the countries at war, the people suffering discrimination, those experiencing famine. And yet, we all are involved. Birthing pains brings to mind also a story that I'll tell quickly before wrapping up. I worked for the US government for 20 years, most of it in Africa, most of it in war zones, and a lot of it in South Sudan. And so I remember that in 2014, weeks after the latest war started, I was there visiting a refugee camp. This refugee camp was filled with people who had narrowly escaped an ethnic cleansing campaign. I had been asked to sit with women in this camp for 2 days as they sort of talked about the accounts that they were experiencing of violence and heartbreak. I spent hours and hours listening to stories, and one thing I could not help but notice was that most of these women were pregnant. It's not something that you could ignore, and having heard so many tales about rape during this war, I could not bring myself to mention or ask to unpack what was staring me right in the face. And one night, after the first day of hearing about the trauma and suffering, I asked my translator, and she was a woman from the same ethnic group, but who had not endured the same fate because she was from the diaspora. And I asked her, how do they manage to carry these children without hatred? And she stared at me for a long time. And then she started laughing at me. She laughed and laughed, and she said, "You have to ask them." And I was so horrified that of course I refused. I said, "No, I'm not going to ask these women who have been through so much this why." And so she took it upon herself to ask the question for me. And when she asked them, they also laughed at me. They told me, "These are not children of rape. These are children that will ensure our survival." One woman even took my hand and held it firmly to her belly and told me, "Pain first and then life." Birthing pains. Birthing pains are a nation that is preparing to swear in 2 Black female senators for the first time in US history, even as the first potential Black female president is soundly defeated. Birthing pains are stories of neighbors helping neighbors, despite having lost whole lives in the floods of North Carolina and much of the eastern seaboard. Birthing pains are churches building communities alongside those who have newly arrived in their cities, in spite of the backlash, in spite of the threats of deportation. Birthing pains are putting ourselves in a posture of participation. Birthing pains are putting ourselves in the contemplative witness that we are readying ourselves to discern the signs of when the time arrives and what we are to do when it does. This is contemplative witness that keeps us moving forward as a church, as a community, as a world, even when every rational analysis points to the end of our lives as we knew them. And maybe in this way, I'll just end with the words of our now past ancestor, theologian Dr. Barbara Holmes, who wrote, "When crisis is the context for the past and present, hopeful people manage what is now and imagine a future. During crisis, we survive in community through a contemplative enhancement of discernment, by tapping into spiritual wisdom sources, by reordering our taken for granted values, and by a reliance upon the Spirit within all of us. This is what is called for in times such as these, a transformative reordering that calls us to the attentiveness of the birthing pains in the midst of crisis. This is what is called for in times like this, that refuses to let us give up our sense of agency and responsiveness. This is the transformative reordering that asks us to reimagine and prepare for a new life that has the potential to be born. Amen.